the day Louisa Doyle stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Creek, Texas. In the spring of 1882, every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared, not because she was the most beautiful woman any of them had ever seen, though she was certainly striking, but because she carried herself like someone who had made up her mind about something and fully intended to see it through. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a modest traveling hat, sharp green eyes that missed nothing, and a leather satchel full of books slung over one shoulder. She wore a practical gray dress dusted from 3 days of travel, and she stood in the middle of the dirt road with a letter in one hand and a map in the other, squinting against the late afternoon sun as though she were calculating the exact distance between where she stood and where she needed to be. The town of Harlan Creek was not a large town. It had a general store, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a meeting hall on Saturdays, a saloon that was considerably more popular than the church, a sheriff's office that looked like it had not been repainted since the end of the war, and a scattering of homes and ranches spreading out like fingers from the dusty palm of the main street. The nearest proper city was San Antonio, 3 days south by stagecoach, which was where Louisa had boarded this particular coach after answering a notice posted on the board outside the teacher's college where she had spent the last 4 years earning her certification. The notice had been simple and bluntly worded in the way of a man who did not like to waste paper. It had read, "Tutor needed. Single father. 1 boy, age 7. Remote ranch, Harlan Creek, Texas. Willing to pay fair wages and provide room and board. Applicants must be serious and capable. Inquire at the office of Judge Harlan Briggs, San Antonio." Louisa had inquired. She had interviewed with the judge, a broad-shouldered man with a magnificent gray mustache who had looked at her credentials and then looked at her with the kind of measuring expression that made her want to stand up straighter, which she did. He had asked her 3 questions about mathematics, 2 about literature, and 1 about whether she was afraid of wide open spaces. She had answered all of them correctly, including the last one, which she answered by saying that she had grown up in Kansas and had never been afraid of anything wide open in her life. The judge had smiled and written her a letter of introduction. So here she stood now, letter in hand in Harlan Creek, Texas, looking for the Shepard Ranch. She asked the man at the livery stable for directions. He was a lean, leather-faced fellow named Coot who chewed tobacco with the focused dedication of a man who had made it his life's work, and he looked at her with the kind of slow, curious appraisal that men in small towns gave to strangers. "Shepard Ranch," he repeated, as though she might have said it wrong. "Ralph Shepard's place." "That is correct," she said. Coot shifted his tobacco to the other cheek and looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You the new tutor for the boy?" "I am." Another pause. Something moved in his expression, something that was not quite concern and not quite pity but lived somewhere between the two. "It's about 4 miles out due east," he said finally. "Follow the creek road past the Denton property, turn right at the split oak that got struck by lightning and keep going till you see the windmill. You cannot miss it. The windmill is the tallest thing out there." "Thank you," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He watched her turn to go, then added as though he could not quite help himself, "He is a good man, Miss Shepard, I mean. He just has not been easy the last few years. That is all I am saying." Louisa looked back at him. "I appreciate the warning," she said, and she said it without irony, because she had learned in her 26 years that honest warnings were worth hearing, even when you intended to walk straight into the thing being warned about anyway. She hired a horse from Coot, loaded her trunk onto a borrowed cart, and set off east along the creek road in the long golden light of a Texas afternoon. The land was beautiful. She had not expected it to be quite this beautiful. The hill country opened up around her as she rode, pale limestone outcroppings rising from the earth like the backs of ancient animals, live oak trees spreading their dark arms over the grass, and the creek running silver and cheerful beside the road, catching the last light of the sun and throwing it back in pieces. The air smelled of cedar and dry grass, and something sweetly faintly floral she could not identify. Wildflowers, bluebonnets, and Indian paintbrush ran in rivers of color along the roadside. She found the split oak and turned right. She found the windmill, and then she found the ranch. The Shepard place was not what she had imagined. She had pictured something rough and unkempt, the home of a man who had been described, even obliquely, as difficult. But the ranch house itself was solidly built, a long limestone structure with a covered porch running the full length of the front, well-maintained, the yard neat, the fences in good repair. There were horses in the paddock, a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, and a pair of dogs sleeping in the shade of the porch steps. It looked like a place that had been built with care and maintained with the same care, the kind of place that spoke of a man who valued order and endurance. What it did not look like was a place where anyone laughed very much. She pulled the cart to a stop in front of the porch and climbed down, shaking road dust from her skirt. One of the dogs raised its head and regarded her with mild interest before lowering it again. The other did not bother to open its eyes. Then the front door opened and a boy appeared. He was 7 years old, exactly as described, small and dark-haired, with his father's square jaw already beginning to show in the roundness of his child's face. He had enormous brown eyes and dirt on both knees and a smear of something that might have been jam on his left cheek. He stood in the doorway and stared at her with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that staring was impolite. "Hello," Louisa said, smiling at him. "Hello," he said back. "Are you the teacher?" "I am. My name is Miss Doyle. What is yours?" "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Henry Shepard. My mama named me Henry after her father, but everybody calls me Daniel because my papa says Henry sounds like a name for a banker, and he does not have anything against bankers. He just does not want his son to grow up to be one." Louisa blinked. Then she pressed her lips together to keep from laughing, because she could already tell that laughing at this child's reports of what his father said was probably going to be a recurring temptation, and she had better develop some discipline about it now. "It is a very fine name," she said. "Both of them." Daniel considered this with the seriousness of a person reviewing important information. "My papa is in the barn," he said. "He said to tell you when you arrived, which I am doing now." And then he turned and ran back inside, and she could hear his feet on the wooden floor as he went. She waited. She stood beside the cart in the evening light and she waited, and after a few minutes the barn door opened and Ralph Shepard walked toward her across the yard. She had been given no description of him. The judge had told her he was a rancher, widowed, with a 7-year-old son, and that had been the extent of it. She had constructed no particular picture of him in her mind, which was perhaps why the reality of him hit her with a force she had not prepared for. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of lean, hard-worked frame that came from years of physical labor. He was 32 years old, though he moved with a weight that made him seem older. He had dark hair, longer than was fashionable, and a jaw that held several days of dark stubble, and eyes that were the deep, still gray of a winter sky right before a storm. He wore a worn canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and leather riding gloves that he pulled off as he walked, and he moved with the unhurried, purposeful stride of a man who was never in a hurry because he had long since made his peace with the fact that the world did not run on hurry. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and his face held the expression of a man who had forgotten how to arrange his features into anything except seriousness. "For years," Coote had said. "He just has not been easy." Looking at Ralph Shepard, Louisa understood with sudden, quiet clarity that what Coote had meant was not difficult. He had meant grieving. This was a man carrying 4 years of grief in the lines of his face and the set of his jaw and the careful stillness of those gray eyes, and he had gotten so used to carrying it that he had probably stopped noticing the weight of it entirely. "Miss Doyle," he said. His voice was deep and measured. "Ralph Shepard, welcome to Harlan Creek." He did not smile. He said it the way a man reads a line he has memorized, correctly but without warmth. "Mr. Shepard," she said, extending her hand. He shook it with the brief, firm grip of a man who was not accustomed to shaking women's hands but understood it was the appropriate thing to do. "I hope the journey was not too difficult," he said. "Not at all. The country out here is beautiful." He glanced at the surrounding hills in the way of a man looking at something so familiar he has stopped seeing it. "I suppose it is," he said, as though the thought were new to him. He helped her with her trunk himself, carrying it up the porch steps with the ease of a man who moved heavy things every day, and he showed her to her room himself, a clean, simply furnished space at the end of the hall with a window that looked south toward the creek and a good writing desk beside it. There was a jug of fresh water and a clean basin, and someone had placed a small vase of wildflowers, those same bluebonnets she had seen on the road, on the windowsill. She looked at the flowers. "These are lovely," she said. Something moved briefly in Ralph Shepard's face. "Daniel picked them," he said. "He thought you might like them. He has been talking about the new teacher arriving since the letter came from San Antonio." A pause. "He has not had formal instruction before. He is a bright boy, but he has had limited schooling, only what I could manage myself in the evenings." Another pause, and this one cost him something. She could see it. "I have been remiss in that regard. You have been managing a ranch and raising a son alone," she said simply. "You have not been remiss. You have been doing what one person can do." He looked at her with those gray eyes, and she had the feeling that no one had said quite that to him in a long time. He did not respond to it exactly, but he did not dismiss it either. He just nodded once and told her that supper would be at 6 o'clock, that Maria, the woman from town who came 3 days a week to cook and help with the house, had left a pot on the stove, and that he rose at 4:30 in the morning, which was not an expectation of her, merely a statement of fact. "I rise at 5:30 myself," she said. "Good," he said, as though this answered a question he had not asked aloud. And then he went back out the door and down the hall, and she heard the front door open and close, and she stood in her new room in the evening light with the bluebonnets on the windowsill and the sound of Daniel's feet somewhere overhead, and she thought that this was going to be a very interesting situation. She was not wrong. Supper that first evening was a quiet affair. Maria had left a pot of beef stew and a pan of cornbread, and Louisa set the table without being asked, which made Ralph stop short when he came in from the barn and found it done. He said nothing about it, but she noticed the slight hesitation, the brief recalibration of his expression. Daniel chattered about the horses and the dogs and a lizard he had found under the porch steps and intended to name Gerald, and Ralph listened to all of it with the patient, attentive silence of a father who was genuinely interested in what his son said, even when what his son said was mostly about lizards. That was the first thing she noticed about him that surprised her, the way he listened to Daniel. Most men she had encountered, particularly men of the ranching type who were generally not given to extended conversations about lizards, listened to children with a kind of polite, distracted tolerance. Ralph Shepard did not. He listened with his full attention. He asked follow-up questions about Gerald the lizard. He suggested, with the gravity of a man discussing matters of importance, that a lizard of Gerald's obvious quality probably preferred to live under the porch than in a box in the house, and that keeping him wild might be the kindest thing Daniel could do for him. Daniel thought about this for a long moment, his small face wrinkled with the effort of serious consideration, and then agreed that Gerald was probably a wild lizard at heart. "Miss Doyle," Daniel said, turning to her with the abrupt subject changes of the very young, "do you know mathematics?" "I do," she said. "My papa says mathematics is the language that the world is built in," Daniel said, with the authority of a person reporting divine revelation. "He says if you understand mathematics, you understand how everything actually works." Louisa looked at Ralph, who was looking at his stew bowl with the expression of a man who had not expected his private opinions to be shared at the dinner table. "Your papa is right about that," she said. "Though I would also argue that words are equally important, because mathematics tells you how something works, but words tell you why it matters." Silence. She had not looked at Ralph when she said it, not wanting him to feel challenged. But she felt him look at her. "That is a reasonable position," he said quietly. She looked up and met his gray eyes across the table. Something passed between them in that moment, not electricity, not yet, but the first faint flicker of recognition that sometimes precedes it, the sense that two people have just discovered that they speak the same fundamental language. Then Daniel knocked his glass of water over, which absorbed everyone's attention for the next several minutes. She began Daniel's lessons the following morning at the dining table, which was large enough to spread books and papers across, and which had excellent light from the east-facing windows. Daniel proved to be exactly as described, bright, curious, and energetic in the particular way of a child who had too much going on inside his mind and not enough structured outlet for it. He learned quickly, asked excellent questions, and had the charming habit of connecting new information to things he already knew about the ranch and the land, which told her that he was a child who had been observing the world closely all his life. Ralph was in and out during the morning, heading to and from the barn and the paddock and the far pastures, with the single-minded efficiency of a man running a working operation largely by himself, with the occasional help of two ranch hands named Bud and Clarence who came when the work required extra hands. Louisa caught glimpses of him through the window, crossing the yard with a saddle over his shoulder, talking to the horses with the same patient quietness he used with his son, repairing a section of fence in the afternoon heat with focused, methodical effort. At noon, when she and Daniel took a break for lunch, she carried 2 glasses of cold water from the well and walked them out to Ralph, who was still at the fence, because it seemed like the natural thing to do, and because she had noticed at breakfast that he had drunk nothing but black coffee since 4:30 in the morning, and the Texas sun was not mild. He was crouched by the fence post when she came up behind him, and he looked up at her with an expression of surprise that was quickly, carefully controlled back to neutrality. He took the water without comment, but he drank half of it in one long pull, and she could see from the slight relaxation of his shoulders that he had needed it. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her for a moment in that measured, gray-eyed way of his, and then he looked back at the fence. "Daniel is taking to the lessons?" he asked. "Beautifully," she said. "He is very quick, and he has an instinct for making connections, seeing how one thing relates to another. That is a rare quality." Something shifted in Ralph's face. The tension in his jaw softened just slightly, just enough for her to see it. "His mother was like that," he said. And then he caught himself, and the softness closed over again like water closing over a stone. "It is good that he is applying himself," he said, in a different voice, the carefully neutral voice he used when he was closing a door. She let the door close. She was not in the business of forcing doors. She thanked him for his time, said she would see him at supper, and went back inside. But she thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. His mother was like that. Said so quietly, so reflexively, with such unguarded tenderness before the guard came back up. 4 years of grief, carried so carefully that it had become part of his posture, part of the way he held his shoulders, part of the permanent gravity in his eyes. And under all of it, underneath all that careful, controlled stillness, there was a man who had once been capable of tenderness, who was still capable of it, she was beginning to think, even if he no longer believed it himself. Daniel told her about his mother on the 3rd day, in the casual, matter-of-fact way that children discuss profound things, between a spelling exercise and a geography lesson. Her name had been Clara. She had died 4 years ago, when Daniel was 3, of a fever that had come on fast and taken her in less than a week. Daniel did not have many clear memories of her, but he had her portrait, a small framed photograph on the mantel in the sitting room, and he knew her from the stories that other people told and from the small domestic things she had left behind in the house. The quilt on the sitting room settee, the rose bushes she had planted along the south side of the house that bloomed every spring whether anyone tended them or not, the way the kitchen was organized, which Ralph had never changed. "Papa does not talk about her much," Daniel said. with the simple observation of a child who had noticed but not yet fully understood. But sometimes at night when he thinks I am asleep, I can hear him sitting on the porch, and he is very quiet, not the regular kind of quiet, a different kind. Louisa looked at the small boy across the table and felt something press quietly against the inside of her chest. "Your father loves you very much," she said. "I know," Daniel said with complete certainty. "He tells me so every night before I go to sleep. He says it is the one thing a man should never forget to say." He paused and then looked at his spelling exercise with a slight frown. "How do you spell journey?" She spelled it for him, and he wrote it carefully. And she looked out the window at the yard and the limestone hills beyond, and thought that Ralph Shepard was a more complicated, more careful, more extraordinary man than he seemed on the surface, and that the surface he showed the world was already something quite considerable. On the fourth day, it rained. A proper Texas thunderstorm rolled in from the west in the early afternoon, the kind that turned the sky the color of a bruise and shook the windows and sent both dogs under the porch. Daniel watched it from the window with wide, delighted eyes, making observations about the lightning that suggested he had been reading about electricity, which in fact he had. He had found a copy of a science almanac in his father's bookshelf, and had been making his way through it for several months. Ralph came in from the barn just ahead of the worst of it, pulling off his hat and shaking rain from his hair in the doorway. And when he walked into the sitting room, he found Daniel and Louisa on the floor in front of the cold fireplace, a large map spread between them, Daniel explaining to her, as though the roles had already begun to reverse themselves, the river systems of Texas, which he had been studying as part of their geography lessons. Ralph stopped in the sitting room doorway and looked at them for a moment. Louisa was lying on her stomach on the rug, her chin propped in her hand, watching Daniel trace the path of the Colorado River with his small finger and speaking with the passionate authority of a 7-year-old who had recently discovered rivers, and Daniel was glowing with the pleasure of being listened to by someone who was genuinely interested. Ralph stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching this. Then Louisa looked up and saw him, and she smiled. Not a careful smile, not a measured social smile, but a genuine, easy, here-I-am smile that caught Ralph Shepard entirely off guard. And Ralph Shepard, who had not smiled in 4 years, smiled back. It happened before he could stop it. It was not a large smile, nothing wide or joyful, just a brief, involuntary upward movement of the corners of his mouth, there and gone in less than a second. But it happened, and they both knew it happened, and for a moment they both stood still on either side of it, him in the doorway and her on the floor in the middle of a Texas thunderstorm, and the air between them held something that had not been there that morning. Then Daniel said, "Papa, come look at the Rio Grande." And Ralph came into the room and sat in the armchair nearest the fireplace, and he looked at the map, and he said something about the Rio Grande that Daniel wrote down in his notebook because he wanted to remember it. And the rain came down hard on the limestone roof overhead, and Louisa watched Ralph's profile in the gray, stormy light, and thought that the smile had changed something, even if neither of them would have known quite how to explain what. The following week settled into a rhythm that felt, within its ordinary domestic frame, quietly extraordinary to both of them, though neither would have admitted it to the other. Louisa taught Daniel from 7 in the morning until noon, then again for an hour in the late afternoon. The lessons had already expanded from the basics she had initially planned, because Daniel's appetite for learning was more voracious than she had anticipated, and because his questions kept pulling her into new territory, into the kind of free-ranging, improvisational teaching that she loved best. They read together in the evenings, sometimes all 3 of them, with Daniel on the settee between the 2 adults while Louisa read aloud from whatever book they had chosen, and Ralph sat with his coffee and listened in that full, attentive way of his. She noticed things about him, steadily and helplessly, the way you notice the weather when you cannot go indoors. She noticed that he was kinder to his horses than most men were to their friends, that he knew the name of every plant on his property and could tell you its practical uses without having to think about it, that he sharpened his tools every Sunday evening on the porch as a kind of meditation, that he had strong opinions about the astronomy of the southern sky and had taught Daniel to identify a dozen constellations, that he read seriously and widely read, which was something she had not expected from a ranching man in remote Texas. His bookshelves held everything from Tennyson to agricultural science to a well-worn copy of Don Quixote, and that he was, underneath all the grief and the careful, quiet, funny, not in an obvious way, in the dry, understated way of someone who sees the absurdity in things but has learned to present it as mere observation. He said something once about a neighboring rancher named Pete Denton that made her laugh so suddenly and completely that she surprised herself, and he looked at her with those gray eyes, and there was a warmth in them she had not seen before, the look of a man who has found himself doing something he forgot he was capable of. She had been there 2 weeks when he found her on the porch late one evening, after Daniel was in bed. She had developed the habit of sitting outside after supper, watching the stars come out over the limestone hills, and on this particular evening the sky was extraordinarily clear and vast and ridiculously populated with stars, the way the Texas hill country sky could be, so different from the city sky she had grown up seeing in Abilene. He came out to do his nightly check on the horses, and on the way back he stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up. "You are still up," he said. "The sky is too good to miss," she said. He looked up at it himself, and she watched his face change in the starlight, the lines of it softening in a way she had not seen in daylight. "It is a good sky tonight," he said. "Do you know," she said, tipping her head back, "I could not see the Milky Way at all in San Antonio. The lights of the city wash it out. You can see it from here with extraordinary clarity." He came up the steps then, which she had not quite expected, and leaned against the porch railing near her chair and looked up at the stars with her, not sitting, not committing to staying, just standing, which was a form of compromise she had come to recognize as characteristic of him, a man who moved toward things in increments, who tested the ground before he put his weight on it. "Daniel tells me you are from Kansas originally," he said. "Abilene," she said. "My father was a minister there. We moved to San Antonio when I was 12, when he took a position at a church in the city." "What made you want to be a teacher?" She considered the question. "My mother," she said. "She taught school before she married my father, and she always said that teaching was the most honest thing a person could do because you were always handing something forward. Whatever you gave to a student, they carried it with them for the rest of their lives. It becomes part of them." She paused. "I like that idea, that what you give does not disappear." He was quiet for a moment. The night insects made their sound in the darkness beyond the porch, and a coyote called somewhere in the hills, distant and lonely. "That is a good way to think about it," he said, and then, after another pause, "Daniel thinks very highly of you. He told me this morning that you were the best person he had ever met who was not his papa or Gerald the lizard." She laughed softly. "That is the finest compliment I have ever received." "He is not wrong," Ralph said, and the words came out quietly as if he had not entirely meant to say them aloud, and he looked out at the dark hills rather than at her when he said it. She said nothing back. She just looked at the stars and let the night hold what he had said, and he stayed at the railing for a while longer before saying good night and going inside. And she sat in the warm Texas darkness and felt something bloom quietly in her chest, something careful and hopeful and thoroughly unexpected. 3 weeks after her arrival, trouble came, as trouble will, from the direction you are least expecting it. His name was Vernon Holt, and he rode onto the Shepard property on a Tuesday morning with 2 other men behind him, and the air of someone who considered himself a man of consequence. He was perhaps 40, heavy-set, with a thick blonde mustache and the kind of smile that was all surface and nothing underneath. He had, Louisa gathered from the conversation she observed from the porch while pretending to read a book, been trying to buy out a section of the Shepard water rights for the last 2 years. And Ralph had declined. repeatedly and with increasing finality, and Vernon Holt had decided to interpret this refusal as a negotiating position rather than an answer. Ralph stood at the bottom of the porch steps and listened to Vernon Holt make his case, and his face was as still and gray as stone. He said no. He said it plainly and without anger, in the same even tone he used for everything, the tone that had no crack in it for pressure to get through. Vernon Holt tried 3 different approaches, 2 of them increasingly aggressive, and at the end of all of them Ralph Shepard said no again and stepped back up onto the porch. "You are making a mistake, Shepard," Vernon Holt said, with the smile that was not a smile. "I have made bigger ones," Ralph said. "Good morning, Holt." Vernon Holt looked at Louisa on the porch, and his gaze lingered on her in the way of a man who considers a woman's presence informative. He touched his hat and rode out, and his 2 men followed him. Ralph stood on the porch after they were gone and stared at the horizon for a long moment. "Will he be a problem?" Louisa asked. "He has been a nuisance," Ralph said. "He will continue to be a nuisance. He is not a dangerous man, only an ambitious one, which in this country can amount to the same thing sometimes." He turned to her. "He is not your concern." "I did not say he was," she said. "I asked a question." He looked at her for a moment. "You ask a great many questions," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite an edge but was not quite not one either. "I am a teacher," she said. "Asking questions is the occupation." Something in his jaw shifted. "Fair enough," he said, and went inside. It was the first moment of friction between them, and it lasted exactly until supper, when he sat down and looked at his plate and said without preamble, "I was short with you earlier. I apologize." She looked up. He was looking at her with those honest, direct gray eyes, and the apology was simple and unadorned, the way he did most things. "Accepted," she said, "and I should have let it be." "No," he said, "you should not have to let it be. You are a person living in this house, and you were entitled to ask." He picked up his fork. "Holt has been circling this property for 2 years. I have no intention of selling him anything. He knows it and I know it, and eventually he will accept it and stop coming by." "And if he does not," she said. "Then I will deal with it," he said, simply and finally, and she believed him, because there was not a single thing about Ralph Shepard that suggested he would fail to deal with something that needed dealing with. The following Sunday, Ralph hitched the wagon and drove into town for supplies, and he asked Louisa if she and Daniel would like to come along, and both of them said yes, Daniel with a shout and Louisa with a smile that she tried to keep from being too wide. Harlan Creek on a Sunday was a different creature from the quiet weekday town she had arrived in. There were people from the outlying ranches come in for supplies and news, and children chasing each other between the buildings, and horses tied along the main street railing, and the smell of fresh bread from the baker's window and wood smoke from the smithy. The general store was run by a woman named Estelle Briggs, a small, spare, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, who was the wife of the judge in San Antonio, and had, as far as Louisa could tell, an opinion about everything and the courage to share it. She took one look at Louisa and said, "You are the tutor. Good. That boy needed someone, and Shepard has been running this place on stubbornness alone for 4 years." She said this loudly and without any apparent concern for whether Ralph heard it, which he clearly did, based on the slight stiffening of his shoulders. Estelle Briggs apparently considered accuracy more important than delicacy, which was something Louisa found she admired. Daniel dragged Louisa to every interesting thing in the store, and then to every interesting thing visible through the windows of the street, and she went with him happily, buying him a piece of peppermint candy from the jar on the counter, and watching him be the social creature he clearly was by nature, charming every adult in the store with the easy openness of a child who had been raised by someone who actually listened to him. She saw Ralph across the store, loading boxes and talking to a rancher she had not yet met, and she watched him the way you watch something you have not yet fully understood. He was different in town, not warmer exactly, but more visible, more seen, and she noticed the way people responded to him, men touching their hats, women nodding with the kind of respect you give someone who has earned it over time. He was known here and known well, and whatever darkness he carried privately, publicly he was clearly a man who showed up for his neighbors and who they trusted for it. The rancher's wife, a cheerful, round-faced woman named Mrs. Perkins, came to find Louisa in the store and said, with no introduction necessary, "Lord, it is good that someone has finally come out there. We have been worried about Ralph for years. He is a good man who has been alone too long, and Daniel is the most wonderful child, but a child needs more than a father can provide by himself. No offense to Ralph. He is doing his absolute best and everyone can see it." She said all of this very fast, and then she smiled and patted Louisa's arm and went off to find her husband. On the wagon ride home, Daniel fell asleep wedged between the two adults, his head gradually drooping until it found Ralph's arm and stayed there. Ralph did not move his arm. He held the reins with his other hand and drove steadily, and the afternoon light lay long and golden over the hills, and Louisa sat on the other side of Daniel and watched the country pass, and said nothing for a while because the moment was complete without words. "He told me last night that he wants to be a geologist when he grows up," Ralph said quietly, not waking Daniel. "He said you told him about how the limestone hills were formed, and he has decided that understanding rocks is important." "It is important," Louisa said. "The ground you stand on shapes everything that grows from it." Ralph was quiet for a moment. "I suppose that is true," he said. "And then he did not used to tell me what he wanted to be. When I asked, he would say he did not know. He has started talking about the future more lately." She looked at his profile against the Texas sky. "That is a good sign," she said softly. He nodded. His jaw moved. "Yes," he said, "it is." The thing between them grew without announcement, the way things grow in good soil. It was in the way he began to leave a second cup of coffee on the kitchen table in the mornings before she came downstairs, because he had noticed that she always made herself coffee first thing, and he was always up before her. It was in the way she mended a tear in one of his shirts without being asked, and left it folded on the back of the chair. And when he found it, he said nothing, but she saw him pick it up and run his thumb over the neat stitching. It was in the long conversations they began to have in the evenings after Daniel was in bed, conversations that started with practical things, the lesson plans, the ranch, the town, and gradually, over weeks, moved into deeper territory, into opinions and histories, and the kind of half-hidden beliefs that people generally keep close to the chest until they decide to trust someone with them. He told her about building the house. He had built much of it himself, he said, with help from neighbors, in the way that things got built out here, communally and laboriously, and with tremendous pride at the end. He had built it for Clara, he said, who had wanted limestone because she said it looked like the house had grown up from the ground rather than being placed on it. She was right about that, Louisa said, because she had thought the same thing herself on the day she arrived. He looked at the wall as though he were looking through it. She was right about most things, he said, not with bitterness. The simple, honoring grief of a man who had genuinely loved his wife and genuinely missed her and had learned painfully to hold both things at once. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Louisa said. "She was," he said, a long pause. "You would have liked each other, I think." He said it quietly as if to himself and then seemed to catch himself and looked at his coffee cup. "I'm not sure why I said that." "Because it is probably true," she said, "and because you know us both well enough to know it." He looked at her across the table and she met his gaze directly, and they stayed in that look for a moment longer than they had before, and she felt the whole careful architecture of the situation shift a few degrees, the way a house settles in new weather. She had been there 6 weeks when Vernon Holt made his second visit, and this time he was alone, which was worse. He came in the early evening, when Ralph was still out in the far pasture and Daniel was inside with Louisa doing his reading. Louisa heard the horse and went to the window and saw Holt dismounting, and she went to the door. "Mr. Holt," she said. He smiled his surface smile. "Miss Doyle, is it? I heard you were out here." He looked past her into the house. "Shepard around. He will be back shortly," she said. She did not open the screen door. She stood behind it and met his eyes with the calm directness of a woman who had grown up around men who thought size was a form of authority and had learned that it was not. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she recognized as the beginning of an attempt to be charming. "I was hoping I could speak to him about some business we have between us," he said. "I will tell him you called," she said. "He will come see you in town if he has anything to discuss." Something flickered in Holt's expression, something less than pleasant. "You have got some spine on you for a school teacher," he said. "Thank you," she said evenly. "I find it useful." He looked at her for another moment and then touched his hat and rode back out, and she went back inside and told Daniel that nothing was wrong and that they should keep reading, and when Ralph came in at dusk she told him calmly what had happened. Ralph went very still. "He came to the house," he said, "while I was away." "He did. I handled it." "I can see that," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite anger and not quite something else, something more complicated and harder to name. He sat down on the kitchen chair as if he needed a moment to think, and then he stood up again and went to the window and looked at the dark yard, and then he turned back to her. "I am going to see Sheriff Calloway in town tomorrow," he said. "This cannot continue." "I think that is wise," she said. "You should not have to deal with that man," he said, and now the thing in his voice was clearer, not just protectiveness over his property or his situation, but something more personal, more directed, the anger of a man who feels that someone he cares about has been put in an uncomfortable position. She looked at him, because the feeling in the room had shifted and she wanted to see his face. He met her eyes and then he looked away and she watched the deliberate control of it, the careful withdrawal. "Thank you," he said, "for handling it. I am glad you were here." The last words came out slightly differently from the first ones, quieter, like something that had more than one meaning, and he was aware of both of them. "I am glad I am here too," she said, in the same quiet register, and left him to his window. He went to see the sheriff the next morning, and what arrangements were made she did not know the details of, but Vernon Holt did not come to the Shepard ranch again. July came and brought with it the full weight of the Texas summer, heat that settled over the hill country like a hand pressed flat. The lessons moved outdoors under the big live oak tree on the east side of the house, where there was shade in the mornings, and Louisa and Daniel sat in the good shadow of it and read, and worked through their mathematics, and talked about history and science and literature in the particular easy way of good student and good teacher who have found their rhythm with each other. Ralph brought them cold water from the well at mid-morning, and sometimes he sat in the grass for a few minutes before going back to work, listening to whatever they were discussing with that quiet, engaged attentiveness. Sometimes he made a comment. Sometimes Daniel turned to him and said, "Tell Miss Doyle about the time you saw the great herd of longhorns, Papa," and Ralph told it, flatly and without embellishment, and the flatness and absence of embellishment somehow made it more vivid, the way some stories become larger the less they are decorated. One morning he sat down in the grass and did not go back to work, and by midday he was more or less conducting the history lesson jointly with Louisa, the two of them talking about the cattle drives and the development of the rail lines and what it had all meant for the country out here, from the perspectives of someone who had lived it and someone who had studied it. And Daniel sat between them and looked from one face to the other with the expression of a person at a very good performance. It was that afternoon that Bud, one of the ranch hands, came up to the house to tell Ralph that there was a problem with the fence line along the north boundary, something that needed immediate attention. Ralph stood up and looked at Louisa and said, in the voice of a man who was making a discovery about himself, "I had forgotten what it was like to talk about things just for the pleasure of talking about them." She looked up at him from where she was gathering the lesson materials from the grass. "You should not forget it again," she said. "No," he said, "I should not," and he went with Bud. She sat under the oak tree for a long moment after they were gone, the warm summer air moving through the leaves overhead, and she pressed her hand flat against the grass and felt the solid earth under her palm and thought that she was in very serious trouble, in the most pleasant possible way. It was Daniel who said it out loud first, because children always do. He said it on a Saturday evening when the three of them had been playing a card game at the kitchen table, a simple game, one Daniel had taught them both, which Daniel claimed he had invented himself, but which bore a suspicious resemblance to a game Ralph said he had taught Daniel the previous winter. And Ralph had just said something that made Louisa laugh so suddenly that she knocked her cards off the table and had to retrieve them from the floor. "I like it when you laugh," Daniel said to Louisa. Then he looked at his father. "And I like it when you smile," he said. "You have been smiling more, Papa." Ralph looked at his son with those gray eyes, and then he looked at Louisa, who had come back up from retrieving her cards and was watching him with an expression she probably could not have controlled even if she had known it was there. "Have I?" Ralph said. "Yes," Daniel said. "You smile when Miss Doyle says something funny, and when she reads to us in the evenings, and sometimes when you come in from the barn and she is in the kitchen and she does not know you are standing there yet." Louisa looked at Ralph. Ralph looked at her. The kitchen was very quiet. "Daniel," Ralph said in a very even voice, "I believe it is your bedtime." Daniel looked at both of them with the serene composure of a child who has just done something he knew he was doing and is prepared to live with the consequences. "Yes, Papa," he said, and gathered his cards with tremendous dignity and went to bed. The kitchen was very quiet. Ralph set his cards on the table and looked at them for a moment. Louisa looked at the lamp on the table and waited. "He is not wrong," Ralph said. He did not look up when he said it. His voice was low and careful, the voice of a man choosing each word with deliberate attention. "I know," she said softly. He looked up. The lamp between them threw warm gold light across his face, and in that light she could see all of it, the grief and the control and the careful, tentative thing that had been growing underneath both of them for weeks, and she thought her heart might break from the beauty of it, this man so slowly and so bravely coming back to life. "I do not know how to," he started and stopped. He pressed his lips together and tried again. "I have not. It has been 4 years since I." Another stop. He looked frustrated with himself in the way of a man who does not often fail to find the words. "Ralph," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said again, and this time it meant something different, something larger, and she meant it too. He reached across the table and his hand covered hers, and they both sat very still, as if the smallest movement might frighten off what was happening. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and it covered hers with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything, and she turned her hand over under his, and he felt it and looked down at their joined hands on the table. "I am not an easy man," he said. "I know that." "Neither am I a particularly easy woman," she said. "I ask a great many questions." Something moved through his face, some slow unbuttoning of the careful control, and the thing that came through it was warm and wry and heartbreakingly genuine. "You do," he said. "And I will not stop," she said. "I would not ask you to," he said. A pause, longer this time, filled with the sound of the night outside the windows. "Louisa." He said her name for the first time, and it was different from the way anyone else said it, lower and more deliberate, the name given its full weight. "Yes," she said. "I am asking if I may, if you would allow me to." He stopped a third time, and then apparently decided that language was insufficient for what he was trying to say and simply leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, gently, with the careful tenderness of a man who has almost forgotten how to do this, but whose body remembers even when his mind hesitates. She closed her eyes and felt the warmth of it and thought she understood now why people in stories described their hearts as swelling, because hers was doing something in that neighborhood. He pulled back and looked at her, close enough that she could see every line of his face, the gray eyes now showing something she had never seen in them before, hope, cautious and enormous. "All right," she said very quietly. "Yes." The weeks that followed were the most extraordinary of Louisa Doyle's life, and she had, she thought, some extraordinary weeks. It was not that everything changed dramatically, because it did not. Ralph was still Ralph, measured and purposeful and not given to large declarations. But the careful distance that had existed between them dissolved by degrees, and what replaced it was something so much better, a closeness that had been built, brick by brick, over weeks of shared meals and shared evenings and shared conversations, and which now had permission to be what it had always been building toward. He brought her wildflowers on a Thursday morning, not formally, not with ceremony, just left them on the writing desk in her room when she came down to breakfast. And when she looked at him across the breakfast table, he looked back at her with those gray eyes, and one corner of his mouth lifted, and she thought that small smile was worth more than a sonnet. They walked together in the evenings after Daniel was in bed, down the creek path where the cottonwoods grew and the water ran silver in the moonlight. He was quiet on these walks, but it was a good quiet, a comfortable quiet, the kind you can only have with someone you trust entirely. Sometimes he took her hand, and he did it in the same deliberate way he did everything, with full awareness and intention, and she felt the warmth of it all the way up her arm. He told her about Clara on one of those walks, really told her not the careful fragments he had offered before but the full story, how they had met, how they had married, how they had built this life together, how the fever had come and what those days had been like. And he told it in a steady, quiet voice with his eyes on the creek, and she listened without filling the silences, and when he was done she said, "She loved you very well." "Yes," he said, "she did, and I loved her." A pause. "I do not think that has to be, I do not think that changes what, Ralph," she said. "I would not be here if I thought it did." He looked at her. "No," he said, "I imagine you would not." She reached up and touched his face, her thumb along the line of his jaw, and he went very still under her hand, and his eyes closed for just a moment, and when they opened again the grief was still there, but the hope was larger. He kissed her properly for the first time on a night in August when the air smelled of rain coming, and the sky was full of heat, lightning flickering over the hills. They were on the porch, standing at the railing as they often did at this hour, watching the distant light in the clouds, and she said something about the way lightning moved through clouds being like thought moving through a mind. And he turned to look at her, and whatever was in her face in that moment, whatever she had let him see of what she was feeling, was apparently sufficient, because he cupped her face in his hands with the careful, reverent deliberateness of a man who is fully aware of the weight of what he is doing. And he kissed her. It was a kiss that took its time. It was not hesitant exactly, but it was thorough, the way he was thorough in everything, present and intentional and warm, and she kissed him back with everything she had been quietly carrying for 8 weeks, and when it ended he pressed his forehead against hers and held her face and breathed. "I have wanted to do that for quite some time," he said. "I noticed," she said, though her voice was not entirely steady. He laughed. A real laugh, low and brief but entirely genuine, the first real laugh she had heard from him, and the sound of it against the Texas night, against the heat, lightning, and the smell of coming rain, was so beautiful that she felt her eyes sting. He heard the change in her breathing because he heard everything, and he pulled back to look at her. "What is it?" he said. "You laughed," she said. He looked at her and then he looked at himself as if checking. "I did," he said, and she could see him realizing what it meant, the same thing she was realizing. "It was a very good laugh," she said. He brought her in against his chest and wrapped his arms around her, both of them looking out at the lightning-lit hills, and she felt his heart under her ear, steady and strong, and he rested his chin on the top of her head, and the rain came and they stayed on the porch and let it come. That fall, Louisa wrote a letter to her mother in San Antonio, and her mother read between every line of it, as mothers do, and wrote back a letter that was warm and full of entirely too many exclamation marks, and then apparently wrote a separate letter to her father, who wrote to Louisa and said, in the direct and measured way of a minister who loved his daughter and trusted her judgment, that he was glad she had found her place. She had found her place. She understood it fully on an October morning when she woke to the sounds of the ranch coming alive, the horses in the paddock, Bud and Clarence's voices across the yard, the smell of coffee from the kitchen, which meant Ralph had been up for an hour already. And she lay in her room for a moment looking at the limestone ceiling, and she felt, with a calm completeness that she had never felt about a place before, that this was home. Not the room, not even the house specifically. But this place, this land, these people, this daily life that had grown up around her like something organic and alive. She had come to be a tutor. She had become something else entirely, though the tutoring had not stopped and was not going to stop, because Daniel was thriving and the lessons were good and they both loved them. It was on that same October morning that Ralph met her in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and waited until she had taken her first sip and then said, in the same direct and unembellished way he said everything, "I would like to ask you to marry me, Louisa, and I want to be honest with you before I ask, because you deserve honesty and not just romance. I am 40 miles from the nearest proper city. I work from before sunrise to after sunset most days. I have a 7-year-old son who is wonderful but also a great deal. I will never be a man who does things with a great deal of noise. I cannot promise you that everything will always be easy." He paused. "But I can promise you that I will be faithful and that I will be present and that I will listen to every question you ask, even the difficult ones, for the rest of my life. And that I love you. I should have led with that." She set down her coffee cup. "Ralph Shepard," she said, "you are without question the least romantic man I have ever met, and that was the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that were not stormy anymore, or at least were not only stormy, and said, "Is that a yes?" "It is absolutely a yes," she said. He let out a long breath, as if he had been holding it for some time, possibly for 4 years, and he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed her, properly and without any ambiguity about his intentions. And when Daniel came downstairs 10 minutes later and found them standing in the kitchen holding each other's hands across the table, he looked at them both with the magnificent composure of a 7-year-old who has seen this coming for months. "Are you getting married?" he said. "Yes," Louisa said. Daniel considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Good," he said. "Gerald will want to be at the wedding." "Gerald is a lizard," Ralph said. "He is a member of this family," Daniel said with serene finality and poured himself a glass of milk. They were married in November in the church in Harlan Creek on a clear, cold morning when the sky was the precise blue of a gas flame. The church was full. Louisa had not known how many people would come, had not fully understood yet how much this community had been watching and hoping for Ralph Shepard. But the pews were packed, and Estelle Briggs was in the front row on the bride's side, wearing an extraordinary hat and the expression of someone whose expectations have been confirmed. Judge Harlan Briggs, who had sent Louisa to the Shepard Ranch in the first place, performed the ceremony himself, which Louisa thought was fitting, and which made him visibly emotional, though he handled it with the dignity of a man who has been a judge for 20 years and takes his dignity seriously. Ralph stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that she had not seen before, presumably purchased for this occasion, and when she appeared at the back of the aisle, he looked at her with those gray eyes full of something she had no more words for, something beyond what language could accurately hold, and she walked toward him through the candlelight with her heart so full she was genuinely concerned about her ability to get through the vows without her voice breaking. She managed the vows. He managed the vows. His voice was steady and low, which she had expected, and he held both her hands in his throughout, which she had also expected. And when it was done and the judge declared them married, Ralph kissed his bride with considerably more feeling than was standard for a church wedding, and several people in the pews made sounds of approval, and Estelle Briggs said something audible about it being about time. The reception was held at the Shepard Ranch, with the neighbors coming from miles around, someone bringing a fiddle, and Bud turning out to have an unexpectedly competent singing voice. Ralph danced with Louisa in the yard in the cold November air, both of them somewhat clumsily because neither of them were practiced dancers, and it was absolutely fine because it was the kind of dancing where the music is beside the point. "I did not know you could dance," she said. "I cannot," he said. "You are doing it anyway," she said. "I am willing to do a great many things I cannot do for you," he said, and smiled at her, and the smile was wide and warm and completely unguarded. Nothing held back, nothing careful about it. Just Ralph Shepard standing in his own yard under the November stars smiling at his wife, and Louisa thought that this was the best moment of her entire life. Daniel danced with Estelle Briggs, who took the lead with remarkable authority for a woman of her size, and he grinned through the whole of it with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child at a party who is entirely confident that everything in his world is exactly as it should be. The winter settled in, and it was the best winter Louisa had known. The limestone house held the cold out with the stolid competence of good construction, and there were fires in the evenings, and the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of wind off the hills, and the three of them together in the lamplight, reading or talking or working through some problem. Daniel had discovered that he needed resolved immediately. Ralph continued to reveal himself in layers, as he always had, slowly and with intention. She learned that he could draw, surprisingly well, that he kept a journal, that he had once, at 19, spent 6 months working on a cattle drive that went from Texas to Kansas, and that the experience had been formative and difficult, and had taught him things about other people and himself that he still thought about. She learned that he had a horror of injustice, a real and active one, that when the sheriff's office in Harlan Creek had failed to properly investigate the theft of horses from the Comanche encampment that wintered near the south boundary, it had been Ralph who had gone to the territorial authorities and made the complaint formally, and who had stood up in the town meeting and said plainly that what had happened was wrong and needed to be made right, regardless of who had done the taking. She learned that he was that kind of man. She had suspected it, knowing it was different. She loved him with a completeness that still occasionally surprised her in its depth. Not the giddy love of first meetings, though that had been there too in its careful, tentative, hide-it-under questions way. Something slower and more structural. The love that becomes part of the way you move through the world. Spring came back around and Daniel turned 8 in March, and for his birthday they rode to a limestone bluff Ralph knew, a long, flat-topped escarpment with a view of the entire hill country stretching south and west in the morning light. And Daniel stood at the edge of it and looked out at his world with his arms spread and his face turned into the wind and looked so entirely like a young man who was going to do remarkable things that both his parents stood behind him and looked at him and then looked at each other. Ralph took her hand. He did it now without thinking about it, with the naturalness of long habit. "Look at him," she said softly. "I know," Ralph said. It was May when Louisa told Ralph she was going to have a baby. She told him in the morning in the kitchen, the same kitchen where he had proposed, the same kitchen table where everything important seemed to happen in this house, and he went very still for a moment, and then he crossed to her and took her face in his hands and looked at her with those eyes that were full and gray and completely unguarded, and he said nothing at all for a long moment. "Ralph," she said. "Give me a moment," he said quietly. She could feel his hands trembling slightly, just slightly, the tiny tremor of a man who controls everything and whom joy has just temporarily gotten past the controls. "Take whatever time you need," she said. He pressed his forehead against hers and she heard him breathe deep and slow and felt the tremble resolve into steadiness. "Thank you," he said, and it was not exactly clear what he was thanking her for the news, for being here, for being who she was, for all of it combined, and it did not need to be, because she understood all the layers of it perfectly. "You are going to be a wonderful father to this one too," she said. "You already are one." He kissed her, and then he went to the door of the kitchen and called up the stairs, "Daniel, come down here, please." Daniel appeared at the top of the stairs with his hair still unsettled from sleep, and Gerald, who had apparently overcome his wild nature enough to sometimes live in a box in Daniel's room, balanced on his shoulder. He looked at both his parents with the alert assessment of a child who can tell from a person's voice that something important has happened. "You have news," Daniel said. "We have news," Ralph said. He looked at Louisa and then back at his son. "You are going to have a brother or sister." Daniel descended 2 stairs, stopped, and processed this. Then he came down the rest at a run and threw himself at both of them simultaneously, which required some logistical management, and said when and which one, in rapid succession. November, we think, Louisa said, and we will find out the which one part in November. I want a brother, Daniel said. He can share my room. I will teach him about rocks, he considered. And Gerald. Gerald is a lizard, Ralph said. A brother could learn a lot from Gerald, Daniel said, with complete conviction. The summer and autumn moved through the Shepard ranch with their customary deliberateness, and Louisa continued Daniel's lessons through all of it, sitting now at the kitchen table rather than under the oak tree as her condition made the ground less comfortable. And Daniel had progressed to reading at a level well above his age, and was devouring the books on Ralph's shelves with the enthusiasm of a small scholar who has just discovered a very large library. He had also, with Louisa's guidance, begun to correspond by letter with a geological society in San Antonio, who had written back with what Louisa privately thought was exceptional graciousness, given that their correspondent was 8 years old. Ralph watched his wife teach his son, and felt something he would have been hard-pressed to name, but which lived in the same vicinity as complete. On a Thursday in late October, he came in from the north pasture at midday to find Louisa sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on its surface, and the expression of a woman who is being very calm about something that is not necessarily calm. He came through the door and read her face in the first second and was at the table in 3 steps. "How long?" he said. "Since this morning," she said. "I wanted to wait until you came in, but they have been getting closer." He sent Bud into town at a gallop for the doctor, because the doctor in Harlan Creek, a compact German man named Dr. Erich Hoffman, who had been practicing in the hill country for 15 years, was better than the nearest alternative, and Ralph had made the arrangements months in advance precisely because he would not be caught unprepared. He was not caught unprepared. He was with her the entire time, which was not done in most households, but Louisa had said with complete simplicity that she wanted him there, and he had said with equal simplicity that there was nowhere else he would be. Dr. Hoffman raised his eyebrows and then apparently decided that the Shepard household operated by its own rules, which was accurate, and got on with his work. At 4 in the afternoon, their son was born. He was loud and red and had Ralph's dark hair, and what Daniel, peering around the doorframe with enormous eyes, immediately declared to be a very good face, which Louisa thought was the most generous review a newborn had ever received. Ralph held the baby with the careful reverence he brought to everything precious, and his face was open in a way she had seen only occasionally, and she lay in the bed and watched him hold their son and felt the fullness of the life she was living press against the inside of her ribs. "What is his name?" Daniel asked from the doorway where he had been permitted to stand. Ralph looked at Louisa. She looked at Ralph. They had discussed names. They had discussed them at length over several months, with the thoroughness that Ralph brought to all important decisions and the range of interests that Louisa brought to all important decisions, and they had arrived at a name they both agreed on completely. "James," Louisa said. "James Henry Shepard," Ralph said. And he looked at her when he said the middle name, and she had told him months ago that she wanted it, the name from Daniel's middle name, the name Clara had given her son for her father. It was a way of honoring her, of weaving her into the continuing life of this family. Ralph had gone quiet when Louisa had suggested it and then said, very carefully, that it was a generous thing to offer, and she had said that it was not generosity, it was sense. Clara was part of this family and always would be, and names were a way of carrying people forward. Ralph looked at Daniel now across the room. "James Henry," he said. "Your grandmother's name, yours too." Daniel understood. He was 8 and very bright, and he understood all the layers of it. He nodded with a gravity that made him look, for just a moment, much older than 8. "Hello, James," he said from the doorway. The baby, as if aware that he was being addressed, made a sound that was not quite a word but had the intention of one. Winter came in gently that year, the coldest month soft with new domesticity, James in the cradle by the fire, Daniel at his books at the kitchen table, Ralph moving through the house and the ranch with the steadied, purposeful contentment of a man who has come back to life by degrees and has now fully arrived. Louisa watched him one evening in February, sitting in the armchair by the fire with James asleep on his chest, one large hand splayed across the baby's back, the other holding a book he had stopped reading, his head tilted back slightly, his eyes half closed, the firelight moving over his face. The lines were still there, because grief does not simply vacate a face, but they held differently now. They were not the lines of a man bearing something alone. They were the lines of a man who had lived through something real, and who had, on the other side of it, found more life than he had allowed himself to expect. She sat across from him with her own book, and Daniel's soft commentary on what he was reading filling the comfortable background of the room, and she thought about the day she had arrived in Harlan Creek in her gray dress with her leather satchel of books, squinting against the Texas sun with a letter in one hand and a map in the other. She had come to tutor a boy. She had gotten a great deal more than she had come for, and she had given, she hoped, something too, not just to Daniel, though she had given him a great deal, and not just to Ralph, though she had given him something she was not entirely sure she could put language to, but to the life of this household, this family, this particular piece of the Texas Hill Country that was now as much a part of her as Kansas and San Antonio and the teacher's college had been. She was made of all of it now, and she was made, increasingly, of this. Spring came again. The rose bushes Clara had planted bloomed on the south side of the house, pink and reliable and full of the particular beauty of things that grow whether or not anyone asks them to. Louisa cut some of them and put them in the kitchen window and stood looking at them for a moment, thinking of Clara, thinking of what it meant to tend a life that someone else had planted and to love it without erasing the planter. "The roses are early this year," Ralph said behind her. She had not heard him come in. He came to stand beside her and looked at the flowers in the window. "They are beautiful," she said. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it simply and clearly, not with pain, just with the honesty that was as natural to him as breathing. Clara, she would have approved of all of this. Louisa looked at him. He was looking at the roses, and his face was at peace in a way it had not been when she arrived, a real and settled peace that had been built, over months and years, out of grief and love and the quiet daily work of being alive in the world alongside people who mattered to you. "I hope so," Louisa said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood together at the kitchen window looking at Clara's roses in the morning light. From the direction of the yard came Daniel's voice, calling for his father with the urgency of a person who has discovered something important, which in Daniel's case could mean anything from a geological formation to a very unusual beetle. And from the cradle in the sitting room came James's voice, awake and requiring attention with the total lack of ambiguity that characterized his announcements. Ralph pressed a kiss to the side of Louisa's head and said, "I will see to Daniel. You see to James." "Divide and conquer," she said. "It is the only sound strategy for a household with 2 Shepard men in it," he said, and the smile was entirely present and entirely easy and entirely his, and he went out the door toward Daniel's voice. She went to James, who was standing up in the cradle holding the railing and regarding the world with the imperious expectation of a person who has somewhere important to be, and she picked him up and held him against her chest, and his indignation subsided immediately into the warmth of being held. She stood at the sitting room window with her son on her hip and looked out at the yard where Ralph was crouching in front of Daniel, listening to whatever Daniel was explaining with the focused, interested attention he had always given his children, and Daniel's hands were moving with the animated emphasis of a person making an important scientific point, and the Texas spring lay all around them, green and gold, and full of the particular promise of a country that will grow anything if you are willing to work for it. Louisa looked at all of it, her family in the May morning light, and felt the particular and irreplaceable satisfaction of a life that had turned out more fully, more richly, more entirely than anything she had imagined when she had stepped off a stagecoach in Harlan Creek, Texas, 3 years ago with a leather satchel of books and a letter of introduction in her hand. She had come to teach. She had been taught in return things she had not known she needed to learn, that grief and love are not opposites, that a life rebuilt on the foundation of a past one is not a lesser thing, that a man who has stopped smiling is not a man who has stopped feeling, and that sometimes the bravest thing a heart can do is simply open itself again to what is right in front of it. She kissed James on the top of his dark head. He smelled of warmth and wool, and the particular sweet, indefinable scent of a baby who is entirely at home in the world. Outside, Ralph was now grinning at something Daniel had said, a full, unguarded grin, the kind that involved his whole face, and Daniel was looking up at his father with the complete, brilliant satisfaction of a child who has made his parent laugh, and the sound of it carried through the open window of the sitting room, warm and real and utterly, thoroughly present. Louisa leaned in the window frame with James on her hip and smiled at both of them and felt, all the way to the marrow of her, that everything was exactly as it should be.